So moving forward onto the introduction of speakers today. So we'll have Sid, who is our CEO, giving you an introduction to RECCo, Elizabeth, who is our Director of Operations, taking you through our services. Pete will be taking you through our data and digitalization program and agenda. John Hawkins will be going through mandatory half-hourly settlement. John Dixon will be going through some points to do with our strategy, and Brian will be taking you through our finances.
Jonathan, sorry to interrupt, your slides aren't moving forward.
They are moving forward for me. So let me see how I can work out how to do that. Can everyone see that now? No. Okay, let me just change my view. Bear with me 1 second.
Yep, we got it now, John.
You're on the right slides now. Right. So Sid, handing over to you.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Sid Gox. I'm the Chief Executive of RECCo, and I'm delighted to provide an overview of RECCo to you. I'll be covering precisely who we are, what we do, some of the highlights for last year, and a very brief introduction to our forward work plan before introducing the rest of the team. So in terms of who we are, we're the custodian and a facilitator of the retail energy market. We're an independent, not-for-profit organisation responsible for managing the retail energy code. So it's very important that we're both independent and not-for-profit. We balance the interests of both customers and also of all of the energy market participants. The RECC was introduced to simplify and consolidate the retail governance arrangements for gas and electricity into a single set of codes. And that code, the retail energy code, is the set of rules which every energy market participant must follow when supplying to energy consumers in Great Britain. And essentially, our role at RECCo is to make it easy for all retail energy market participants to comply with their obligations under the RECC. So what we do, we provide a range of services and programs to facilitate a better retail energy market. We provide our core services, which many of you will be familiar with: the code manager, inquiry services, central switching service, other services which are key to delivering an efficient retail energy market. In addition to that, we run core programs to implement improvements and new policy initiatives. So programs would be things like theft projects that we've been running. New policy initiatives would be things like the market stabilisation charge. In discharging all of our role, we act as an intelligent customer, procuring, managing, monitoring and incentivising the delivery of our outsourced service providers. And ultimately, our role is to ensure that we provide excellent service, which is value for money. So some of the highlights for 22 and 23, our real focus was on service delivery and delivering of key projects. Last year was our first full year of running the code, the fully integrated code manager service, and we do recognise that there were some teething problems from go live, for which reason we put in place a post-implementation plan to rectify that. In particular, we made several improvements to the portal and also to email. All of those service improvements were completed at no additional cost to RECC parties. We also listened that the digital navigator, although the functionality worked very well, the email didn't actually wasn't so easy to see clearly all of the information and search it. So we launched the digital navigator to overcome that. In also listening to parties, we also updated the performance assurance catalogue and implemented the performance assurance regime. In addition to our first full year of operation, we also successfully went live for the industry-wide central switching program. At RECCo, that involved for us putting in place RECC version 3, onboarding the electricity inquiry service, negotiating the new gas inquiry service and making sure it was fully integrated with CSS, and transitioning all of the CSS program into RECC governance and making changes to all of our service provider contracts, all of the reporting to make that happen. In addition to implementing the central switching service, we demonstrated that we could implement change at pace. Within 3 months of being mandated by Ofgem to launch the market stabilisation charge, we we designed the service, procured all of the contracts, procured the technical solution, and within 3 months we were ready to run the market stabilisation charge. And the first charge was actually processed with monies received from market participants and distributed in December. One of the things that took us longer than we had anticipated was coming up with a theft estimation methodology. We overcame a number of challenges in accessing data, but we came up with a first good estimate in the last 10 years of the value of energy theft in gas and electricity. And we believe that is a value of up to £1.4 billion, which focuses our mind on what we need to do in the future to reduce theft going forward. While doing all of these core activities, we've also established robust financial and commercial processes to deliver the service to you. And we've also continued to develop the capacity and capability of the team at RECCo. We started the service in September 21 with 7 permanent members of staff. We're currently at 26 members of staff, and we believe we're soon approaching a stable level to deal with the activities that we're discharged to do. So moving on to the forward work plan itself, in terms of our strategic approach, our mission hasn't changed. We continue to facilitate the efficient and effective running of the retail energy market, and we're looking to promote a number of outcomes. But what we thought we'd make it easy in highlighting the specific outcomes that we're trying to achieve. And you'll see that reference throughout the major activities that we're doing. So what are those 5 key outcomes? We call them the 5C. Ultimately, everything that we do for RECCo is fined by the consumer. So we've got to deliver appropriate and good consumer outcomes. We know that we've got to address climate, and we believe that retail energy data can play its part in achieving net zero. So climate is a major role. We know that we need to have a competitive and vibrant retail energy market in the UK, and that's vibrant competition, both in the retail sector itself, but also amongst our suppliers, so that we can see new innovation coming to achieve better outcomes for consumers and for net zero. And in doing all of that, we want to deliver good value for money and cost. And the final element is we know this industry needs to change for the better, to deliver better consumer outcomes, to achieve climate control, to achieve better competition. It would be easy for us to say we just wanted change, but we don't want change for change's sake. We want to genuinely have change that makes improvement to the market that is needed and which can be done at pace. And that's why our fifth C is catalysing improvement. So at a high level, our forward work plan is a continuation of our plan from last year, and that's focusing on our core service delivery and our key programs. So at a very high level, what we're going to do and what my colleagues will present in greater detail is we will deliver and evolve our RECCo services. And Elizabeth Lawler will explain precisely what we're going to do on that front. We're going to continue to develop RECCo policy, and John Dixon is going to explain some of the policy initiatives that we see in the environment where we believe at RECCo we could help. And we need to deliver against our major programs. And those three major programs are data and digitalization, harnessing data to deliver better consumer outcomes, delivering net zero and security of supply, focusing on energy theft and data and digitalization. Pete Davies will talk about data and digitalization. Energy theft, having now scoped the size of the prize, John Dixon is going to explain precisely what we're going to do with you to help to tackle energy theft. And our last major project, John Hawkins is going to talk about our contribution, which has now become significant in terms of the market half-hourly settlement programme. And while doing all of this, we will continue to develop the RECCo organisation so that it remains effective and efficient at delivering all of our mandate. And with that in mind, I'd like to pass over to Elizabeth Lawler, who's going to talk about our RECCo services and the evolution of our RECCo services.
Thank you very much, Sid. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining. As Sid said, I'm Elizabeth Lawler. I'm RECCo's Director of Operations. Essentially, I am responsible for the day-to-day delivery of the RECCo services and for ensuring that our service providers deliver their code and their contractual obligations to the required quality standards. So I'm going to start off by taking you through the RECCo operating model to explore why it's different to some of the other code governance models that you may be familiar with, the benefits that this RECCo operating model brings, and how that will support the programme we're setting out in our forward work plan today. So if we look back to around sort of 2018, 2019, at the start of the vision for the RECCo and when RECCo was established, there was a commitment to address some of the challenges that we were all seeing and experiencing in some of the previous code governance models. And so under the predecessor retail codes, there was an overdependence on industry members to fulfill the executive function alongside their day-to-day responsibilities. And where delivery for operational functions was outsourced, it was difficult to develop and drive strategic direction and to apply robust service and contract management. So if we look at the RECCo operating model, we've consciously introduced this executive layer that sits between the contracted service and systems providers and the RECCo board. And the role of this function is to offer thought leadership and strategic thinking, to drive positive and proactive change, and to deliver robust service and contractual management on behalf of the industry parties. RECCo's strategic direction, the forward work plan that we're setting out today, then flows down through our service provider contracts and their deliverables. And our intention is that through the publication of the forward work plan and also the codes roadmap, which I'll talk about a little later, industry has a clear picture of the work programmes and the changes that will be progressed in the short and medium term, helping you to better plan your business activities and to ensure a cohesive and joined up approach across this sector of the market. If we can move on, please. Thank you. So what I wanted to do briefly now is just talk about the RECC services that are all required to make up the delivery of the day-to-day operation of the RECC. So essentially, these RECC services ensure the effective and efficient operation of the code. We provide 17 services to support industry and help them discharge their regulatory obligations. And increasingly, we're also becoming directly responsible for the security and stewardship of the industry data that facilitates them. And Pete's going to go into a bit more detail about what that means and what that looks like for you as stakeholders in his presentation. So we recognise then the need to ensure that industry parties and stakeholders receive a high quality, reliable, intelligent and accessible services, and that it's our responsibility to ensure that this is the case. To support that, we include service performance regimes in our service provider contracts. These cover the end-to-end service term, including mobilisation and operational delivery. We ensure that the regimes are not punitive, but reflects a fair balance of risk and reward and incentivises our service providers to deliver. Performance is independently assured, and where any service credits are owed, these are deducted from the service cost, reducing the monetary impact on RECC parties. And we've seen the application of this model in practice this year, where RECCo's recovered more than £900,000 in service credits and delay payments. In the coming year, we'll continue to ensure that service providers deliver on their commitments and continue to offer improvements. The slide that you're looking at now sets out the core RECC services that you'll be most familiar with. And my colleagues are shortly going to go into the detail of our strategy and forward work plan. But in order to deliver that vision, we need to have a high quality, stable, proactive and responsive services in place. And I just wanted to focus briefly on what we've achieved to date and the continual improvement of the core services in the coming year. So looking back this year, we've encouraged and supported our service providers in a number of continuous improvement initiatives. The Code Manager has implemented a series of technical changes to the portal and the EMAR to improve user experience. That includes adding the RECC wiki pages, which you can find all kinds of information, fact sheets, questions to industry issues that you may have. The digital navigator, so you can move through the digital code more easily, and performance dashboards, so you can see your individual performance against the RECC standards. Operationally, they've reviewed the prioritisation matrix to ensure that change proposals that have a material impact on positive consumer outcomes get progressed more quickly. And they've established the RECC issues group and 2 metering forums to provide a collaborative spaces for industry to come together and discuss operational issues. We've been working closely with the energy inquiry services, so the EES and the GES, to explore ways of making data more readily available to those parties entitled to receive it, and also exploring new use cases. For example, EES data is now used by BEIS to help deliver the energy support scheme. John's going to talk in more detail about our theft strategy, but I wanted to call out the continued excellent work of Crime Stoppers and the Energy Theft Tip-Off Service. Next year, we'll be looking at how we can further invest to increase awareness across the industry and members of the public and promote the Stay Energy Safe campaign. The biggest challenge and change for RECC services and possibly for industry as well last year was CSS Go Live, and in particular for us, the transition from the switching programme to RECC governance at the start of November. It's fair to say that we're still in the early stages of developing those enduring operational relationships and working with the DCC to fully embed that switching operator function and to deliver a service that meets industry needs and expectations. This will continue to be a key area of focus for myself in the coming year and for RECCo more generally, and the Code Manager alongside our DCC colleagues. Clearly, as the RECC service recipients, your feedback is critical to informing future service improvements. We recently conducted our annual stakeholder satisfaction survey, and thank you to all who participated in that, and we'll be able to share the results shortly. The key outcomes of that will be enhancement and improvement plan to be delivered across the RECC services in the coming year.
Thank you to Elizabeth and Sid for running through those important questions and sections about RECCo and what we are doing and what we've been delivering and the crucial services that we have been providing. I have one question that I want to pose to Elizabeth at the moment, which has come in, which asks, how will the change management process change in the future to improve its efficiency?
Okay, thank you. That's a very good question. We know that the change process is a key area of interest for parties. There's been an extremely high volume of change proposals that have been submitted since go live. I think we're up to number 90 now in the first 15 months of operation. And if I'm honest, I don't see that really particularly changing over the coming year. I don't see that slowing down, because obviously we've got the new sets of arrangements still bedding in. People will find areas that they want to change. There's just so much going on in industry at the moment. So I think it's fair to say that that's an area where there is scope for improvement, and probably also a need for it. So let's try and answer the specifics of how. So if we look back at the Code Manager has recently been implementing quite a few initiatives, and we should start to see the effects of those coming shortly. So changes to the portal to make it easier for parties to see where a CP is at in the change process, and that should help parties know the points at which they can engage in the process with impact assessments, consultation responses. The more information that the Code Manager gets back through those channels from stakeholders, the better solutions they're able to form, and the more efficiently they can take change proposals forward. As I mentioned earlier, they've reviewed the prioritisation matrix, so that change proposals that have a particular positive consumer impact, or ones that are causing performance issues or pain points for industry parties, can be moved forward more quickly. We've got the REC issues group, so parties can come together and discuss issues, start to develop solutions, and then more fully formed CPs that have a greater likelihood of success, I guess, can be moved forward more quickly. Recently, a change has been made to allow housekeeping CPs to go through a truncated approvals process, which means then that resources freed up to work on the more complex CPs, and again, push those forward and drive efficiency there. The Code Roadmap is an initiative that's come forward. I think there's a launch webinar. I think Beth from the RTS is doing that tomorrow. And what the Code Roadmap will do is to help batch and group changes that are impacting a similar area or issue together. So we should see fewer kind of piecemeal or individual changes, and bigger changes that could take out our kind of core solutions and move industry forward. And I should say that finally, because we do recognise that this is an area that could do with a bit more scrutiny. So RECCo's almost completed its own user experience review of the change process, and I've seen some people on the call today, and I know that they've participated in that, so thank you for that. And what that will do is give us feedback on more areas for improvement that we can take forward in the year ahead. So in summary, change process is a core, it's a key function within the code. There is a high demand. There's a lot of changes coming through, and so we recognise it as an area that we can look to try and drive more efficiency through. I hope that answers the question. If there's any more, I'm quite happy to have a bilateral conversation with anyone, or just send any comments and feedback through, and be very pleased to take that on board. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. We're now going to move into the next section of the webinar, which will be really going through the key items from the strategy and forward work plan. Just to let you know what you've got in store for this part of the webinar. First will be Pete talking through transformation and data and digitalization, followed by John on mandatory market-wide half-hourly settlement. Moving then on to the other John to talk about theft and our policy development, and before Elizabeth will take you through what we're going to focus on in terms of evolving our services over the coming year. I'll also encourage you to continue to use the Q&A box at the top to submit your questions. After all of those detailed run-throughs, we will reconvene for another Q&A. So please do get your questions in as they occur to you as the presenters are talking through their sections. So I'm now going to hand over to Pete, who's going to kick off the section on transformation.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the questions so far and the handover. My name is Pete Davis. I'm the Director of Data Technology and Transformation at RECCo. And today I'm going to take you through an overview of the programs, and then I'll talk very specifically about data and digitalisation before handing over to my colleagues for some of the specifics. Next slide, Jonathan. Thank you. So as Sid introduced in his opening section, we're looking at our transformation programme against the 5 C's of the consumer, climate, competition, cost, and catalysing an improvement. Our first focus area or programme is on data and digitalisation, and that's principally focused around opening up the data securely, utilising GDPR as an enabler, and also improving the user experience of our existing services. And Elizabeth provided an example where we are applying UX or user experience approaches to the change process. The second programme or focus area is on theft reduction, which John Dixon will take you through, and that's principally focused around safety. It is a high risk to individuals, and it's important we do our best to safeguard them. And equally, there is a large sum of money behind that, which we published in a recent report following our theft estimation methodology. Then the third focus area or programme for us is market half hourly settlement, a mandatory programme which many of you will be familiar with, but this forms a big part of our activities next year and is a material change to industry, both technically and procedurally. Then John Dixon will return to talk about our RECCo policy development, and that will particularly focus around priority services register and heat aspects. And then finally, Elizabeth will return to talk about evolution of our RECCo services. So data and digitalisation. Principally broken this into 2 areas. One is a stronger data focus and the other one is a stronger digitalisation focus. And for our data one, you could group that principally into 3 sub-themes. So during this financial year, we've started our Open Data Consumer Consent project, which is looking at RECCo controlled data, working with industry to understand how consumers could be consenting to access to that data. And that's very much an analysis and understanding phase. During the next financial year, the outcomes of that analysis we'll be looking to implement over the coming years. That will be delivered in an agile way because at this point in time, we don't know the exact specifics of what data and how the data can be opened up. Equally, we don't know the end solution for a consumer consent system, which will go through consultation with many of yourselves. So here we'll follow an agile delivery to allow us to adapt as the most important topics come to the fore. The second sub-theme, which I've started to indicate in the prior, is around consumer consent. So the Energy Digitalisation Task Force, or EDIT, as many people know it, identified the need for a consumer consent portal. Now, consumer consent portal is maybe suggesting too much of a solution. We believe that there needs to be a period of engagement with industry, which we're currently undertaking, to identify the best method for a consumer consent mechanism, which principally allows the consumer to tell industry wants what its consent needs are, whether that be access to smart-based devices for control, whether that be access to consumption data, whether it be access or control to other data items as and when the industry evolves. That activity will also be building upon Ofgem's data best practices guidance and adopting the open first basis that was also identified in the EDIT, or Energy Digitalisation Task Force. So the first 2 sub-themes kind of focus very much on changes to stuff and improvements to stuff. The third one is around data quality improvements. We recognise that industry is increasing its use on data, and we can certainly see that through the inquiry services where the metrics on terms of use have significantly increased over the last 12 months. So there's evidential and there's quantitative and qualitative evidence of increased use of data. That means with an increased reliance, we also need to monitor and understand the quality, and where it's applicable, or sensible, RECC will run initiatives to improve that data quality. As Elizabeth also highlighted in her previous section, RECCo will continue to follow a competitive procurement basis. We believe this gives best value to industry and ultimately the consumer. The second area, moving on from data onto digitalisation, again, conveniently has three sub-themes. The first one is around continuing to evolve the RECC services digitally. And we've started some initiatives, one which Elizabeth highlighted with the user experience journey on change. We're also doing a user experience journey on not crossed meters, erroneous transfers or erroneous switches. We intend to look into some other ways and other user journeys that will improve the running services for industry and the consumer. And that means we'll continue to evolve those services digitally. We're also conscious that actually the codes, licenses, regulatory activity is a burden on industry in some cases. It takes time. Therefore, we will be looking to drive as much simplification in the user experience as possible. I don't think it's RECCo's place to come up with fancy, colourful, wonderful, whiz-bang approaches. Actually, what we need is a cleaner, simpler way of interacting with the RECC so that industry can then focus on the implementation of that or other wider business aspects. The second sub-theme is more of a technical aspect. So historically, RECCo has gathered a number of services that Elizabeth went through previously. Many of those existed before the RECC and RECCo's creation. For us to evolve with industry's needs, involve with the consumer's need, we recognise that we're going to have to change how we architect our system. So this is where a microservices architecture comes into play, and something called an API gateway. So effectively, an API gateway will provide a single route into RECC services, and behind that, the number of microservices will exist, which then allows a level of flexibility to change them, but it also reduces the burden on industry in terms of interfacing to that, because there is one entrance point which should remain fairly static. We also recognise that because we've got a number of historic services, this is not going to happen overnight. This will take multiple years to do, and we need to do that in a considered and sensible way. The third item here is the BEIS SSES consultation, or Smart Secure Energy System. During the consultation there, it was recognised by RECC, by members of industry, that actually the RECC has a role to play in the SSES consultation. That would principally be around time of use tariffs and potentially some consumer consent aspects, all of which our response you can read on our website and is publicly available. But should BEIS move ahead with that consultation, we've put a budget line in to handle any sort of implementation and project work that happens. If BEIS choose to not move ahead with that, that money will naturally not be spent. So that concludes the digitalisation. I do welcome any questions people have in the chat, and happy to engage offline. I would now introduce John Hawkins.
Hi, I'm John Hawkins. I'm leading on the market-wide half-hourly settlement project for RECCo. So firstly, for those who aren't familiar with market-wide half-hourly settlement, the programme was created off the back of the electricity settlement reform significant code review that was launched by Ofgem in July 2017, and this was launched to consider the opportunity presented by the installation of smart meters to make the settlement process more accurate and timely, and act as an enabler for new products and services. And it's thought that this would deliver positive outcomes for consumers through overall lower bills, reduced environmental impacts, and enhanced security of supply and a better quality of service across the energy system. Off the back of that, Ofgem published their decision in April 2021 to introduce half-hourly settlement on a market-wide basis and to implement the target operating model that was recommended by the Design Working Group. In that, they set out that RECCo would act as the senior responsible owner and the implementation manager of the programme. And further to that, a governance framework was introduced in section C12 of the BSc, which set out the requirements of the programme and the overarching governance model. And as part of that, RECCo is obligated to comply with those requirements through the main body of the REC in clause 5.25. RECCo has since launched our programme to manage that, and the project aims to identify and deliver all of the required changes needed to the retail energy market in order to implement market-wide half-hourly settlement. So broadly, in terms of what that means for requirements for RECCo, the first one is probably the more obvious one, which is that there is a new target operating model being implemented in the market. There is a detailed design that's been developed by the MHHS programme to enact the implementation of that, and that will need to be reflected in the code. So where aspects of that design sit within REC-governed processes or impact REC-governed processes and systems, that needs to be reflected in the code. So there is a code drafting work stream going on with the MHHS programme that RECCo are engaged with in order to deliver that. There are also what was being referred to as consequential changes. So that core design is looking at how you introduce the new arrangements to make settlement work. But then there are broader applications of that. When that's implemented, it will have effects on wider aspects of the market arrangements. And so we need to try and proactively identify those impacts as early as we can and make sure that those are captured and implemented in accordance with that timescale as well. There are impacts to REC systems and services, the main ones being that there's quite significant changes required to the electricity inquiry service, which I'll go into a bit more shortly, but that's needing to be updated to move from a overnight batch processing model to a near real-time update model. The central switching service will need some changes to look at how it manages changes in market roles and market data, and also to ensure that it can support the migration period of moving all 31 million meter points to the new arrangements. And there's a requirement for both of those services to participate in MHHS integration testing, so that's the systems integration testing and user integration test phases, and to stand up the required environments for the duration of those test phases. And for RECCo, there's a number of requirements and deliverables that I'll cover off, and this is a high-risk, high-profile project with equivalent scale, scope and complexity that we've just seen with the CSS implementation. That involves close external scrutiny and assurance of RECCo project delivery as a central party, and there's a need to move at the pace of the fastest in this programme, and as a central party, RECCo has to ensure that all required changes are ready at that point in time, and so we need to ensure that the necessary resources are stood up and the necessary programme controls are in place to deliver in that type of environment. So I think the important thing to note here is that all of these things are typical cost drivers in this type of programme that's expected to run over the next 3+ years. I touched briefly on the changes to the electricity inquiry service, and one of the things the new target operating model is introducing is a new event-driven architecture. And when the detailed design was being considered for this, there was a need identified that's since transpired into a requirement for the inquiry service to consume and update and make data available as close to the point of that data being updated as possible. So that's us moving away from receiving a daily file from the various distribution networks overnight and updating everything in one go, to receiving individual events at various points in the day, and making sure that's updated and exposed to users at that point in time. It's quite a fundamental change to the way this works. And I've given a brief diagram there which shows that we'll be looking to do that by taking updates from the new data integration platform that's being introduced by the programme, and we will be taking updates from there as soon as that data's been updated, and consuming that and using that to update EES data and make it available to EES users as soon as possible. And we've identified that as the simplest and most cost-effective way of achieving that outcome. So for our project, we've got 5 core work streams that we're looking at. So we've got a regulation and governance work stream that's delivering the code drafting I mentioned earlier, and is also looking at the impacts to our performance assurance framework, and also how we'll manage market qualification, as any market role that's impacted by this will need to go through some form of qualification or requalification as part of one of the program test phases, and RECCo will need to be engaged in that as to where it will impact the qualification status of REC parties. We've got a design and build work stream, which is focusing on some of the aspects we spoke about before. So that's identifying the impacts to REC services, impact assessing those, and working with our service providers to deliver the required changes to that in the program timescales. Our testing work stream is focused on the integration testing required by the MHHS program and engagement in that phase. So that's making sure that all the necessary environments are stood up, that resources are in place to support those test phases, and that we're appropriately prepared to both enter those test phases and successfully exit those test phases. Later in the program, we've got a work stream focusing on our own operational readiness. This is very much looking at the point of implementation. Do we have everything prepared and in place for REC parties and stakeholders to be able to navigate those new arrangements? So do we need any changes to the REC portal, to the EMAR to be in place to manage that? Do we need to update operational processes such as change management, market entry, market exit as a result of it? And then do we need to look at knowledge and guidance we've got available through tools such as the REC Wiki and Category 3 guidance documents, and make sure that those are appropriately up to date and available to parties ahead of implementation. And finally, we're focusing on stakeholder engagement. So as we move into the delivery phase of this, how do we keep all of you up to date? How do we bring you in and consider your views at decision points where that's needed? So that is, where is it appropriate to get industry around the table? Where is it appropriate to provide update webinars, provide specific and dedicated training in particular areas? And then we'll be looking to keep you updated as standard through our monthly newsletters. So that's it for me. I'll hand over now to John Dixon, who's going to take you through energy theft.
Morning, everyone. As noted, I'm John Dixon. I'm Director of Strategy and Development at RECCo. So I'll talk a little bit about our theft reduction strategy and about our wider programs that are, I guess, more reactive to what's happening in the regulatory environment. So if you can have the next slide, please. So the strategy itself is intended to be a fairly simple one that we've taken some lessons from existing anti-fraud and anti-theft strategies and other industries. So it's got those self-reinforcing component parts, but As with anything else that RECCo does, we need to base this on a solid business case. As Sid touched on earlier, we didn't really have that in terms of a robust and up-to-date estimate of the scale of theft in Great Britain. Most of the estimates that industry participants were using hark back to Ofgem ones from around 10 years ago. So there was a need for RECCo to update that primarily so that we had a robust baseline against which to not just assess the kind of proportionality of any initiatives we might undertake, but then to be able to replicate that methodology and judge whether or not we're having any success or not. So glad to say we've completed that first pass of theft estimation methodology, which was completed by Capgemini, so working independently of any particular outcomes or assumptions that RECCo itself may have made. Is very much an evidence-driven bottom-up assessment of the current instances of theft and the scale of theft within the market. So we now have that robust estimate, which is the upwards of up to £1.4 billion across both gas and electricity that we heard earlier. There is a large range in that, and we'd expect that over time that model can be replicated. New data will come into it, and we'll further train the model to hopefully narrow that range. And we're also aware that that's although it's a big number, it's much smaller than some of the estimates that are used elsewhere from a kind of a top-down approach of how much of non-technical losses are attributable to theft. So again, we'd hope to work with stakeholders going forward to try and narrow those ranges of assessments. But for the time being, that's as robust a figure as we can get based on the data we have. And one of the things we'll be aiming to do going forward is to procure additional data sets and further refine that model going forward. And that'll be part and parcel of the work we'll touch on in a moment. I guess the biggest or the most impactful area we can work on is also the most difficult to measure insofar it's obviously far better to prevent theft occurring in the first place rather than detecting it once it's already happened. So there'll be ongoing work with Crime Stoppers and the marketing campaigns that they run, again focusing on safety more than the financial aspects of it, as Pete touched upon. Each and every instance of theft is an unsafe situation, so we need to bear in mind that this is primarily our aim to make sure the industry or consumers are using energy safely. We also need to make sure that the costs of it have been attributable fairly, and it shouldn't go without notice that all of these stolen amounts of energy, that it's not a victim of crime. They are spread across bill paying consumers. It doesn't just disappear into the ether, and we estimate that potentially up to £50 of everyone's energy bill currently is theft that's spilling over from elsewhere. So again, we can break a contribution to cost of living by trying to remove those costs and making sure that people are paying for the energy they do consume. But again, it's about focusing on safety primarily. I'll come on to what we're doing to enhance the prevention later on. The next aspect is to try and improve the ability of industry parties to detect theft when it is happening. So this is in part by providing them with better quality data, insights from that data, potentially new analysis that we can draw from it, but also to make sure the incentives are there to carry out that activity. The incentive schemes that we operate have been around for several years, that were carried over from the legacy codes, and they really only offset some of the costs of carrying out an investigation. They're not a genuine incentive in the sense that they can provide a net reward to parties to carry out those activities. So again, we'll touch upon what we might be doing going forward to try and address that. And then ultimately, responding to some of the feedback from industry, we need to make sure that parties are better empowered to do something in these instances of theft once they do find it. And that could range from just sharing of best practice in terms of what to do in those situations, through to the better gathering and collation of evidence to pass on to the police if it's an instance of serious criminality, etc., and try and improve the prospects of prosecution. So that's the strategy in a nutshell. In terms of what we are taking forward as our priorities for the next year, This has very much been informed by the output of an industry-wide workshop that we held in November, which was attended by over 50 representatives, not just of RECCo parties, but Ofgem were there. We had representatives of the police, fire brigades and other agencies, literally discussing theft in an open and frank environment, and really sharing some insights that we wouldn't ordinarily get through just industry discussion and looking at it through kind of one lens or one area of the value chain. And I think that led to some interesting learnings in terms of what's happening on the ground, or what problems people are having, and what people elsewhere in that value chain or in other agencies, etc., could do to help them. So we've taken forward a long list of actions from that workshop. And the first and foremost will be to have a group that can discuss these things and take ownership for those actions. So we will be re-establishing a theft expert group, similar to the metering expert panel as touched upon earlier on, so we can make sure that that expertise is gathered in one place. We can make sure we're making good use of that expertise and share it. So that will support the subject matter experts that have been working with RECCo on years. But we also want to broaden that out. So rather than just have a small group that may be meeting fairly regularly, but not necessarily sharing its findings across the whole of industry, we'll also have an open forum periodically, so that we can share what we're doing as RECCo, what the group have been progressing in terms of the actions, and literally keep up on actions that are relevant elsewhere in the industry. We recognise from the workshop that some of these things that need to be taken forward are not necessarily for RECCo itself, or even can be delivered through the REG. So, for instance, there are impacts on settlements, for instance, that act as a disincentive to suppliers reporting the full volumes of theft that they may discover, etc. So we'd need to work with Alexon, for instance, on a BSE modification, or Exoserve on a UNC modification to try and change those things. So those actions would sit outside of REC, but we need a place where they can be held together and provide some oversight in a single place. So that's the first thing we'll be taking for re-establishing those kind of industry groups. Secondly, we want to make sure that there is continuing and growing awareness of the scale and the problems of theft. So this is not just about putting out that report estimation methodology, although that was an important part, but continuing to with our funding of the Stay Energy Safe campaign, make sure that the public are aware not just of the threat of prosecution, if you like, the real dangers of meter tampering, the fact that it can lead to fires and electrocutions, and can and does lead to serious injury and death. We also want to raise awareness within the industry itself, not just of the fact that it's a problem, which everybody knows, but what's being done to try and resolve it, and again share that kind of best practice, and also share awareness outside of the industry and outside of consumers to make sure that other agencies can work more effectively with us. We found even the reporting and the gathering of data is difficult because of the way it's recorded differently by different agencies. You know, we found through the collection of freedom of information requests, etc., that things like electrocutions from meter tampering or fires due to meter tampering are not recorded as such, and so it's difficult to gauge the real scale of the problem. And so there may be things we can do to at least better inform our data gathering, etc., by sharing the awareness of the problem and asking those agencies to work with us on a more consistent classification of things, etc. And finally, to make sure that agencies who we might want to collaborate with, like the police, are fully aware of the problem and don't see it as being a victimless crime. And equally, things like people like MPs, etc. You know, we don't want them just jumping on the backs of the utilities whenever there's an opportunity to give it a bit of a kicking. They need to understand that there's a real problem here that we as an industry need to solve. It's not just about going after revenue. So that's the second aspect. Pete touched upon earlier on a lot of the work that we're doing around data gathering and analytics. So very much an output of that will be to better inform our theft reduction strategy. Again, we learned through the theft estimation methodology that some of the data we'd assumed would be out there and readily available within the industry is just difficult to get hold of. So part of what we'll be doing is to kind of work back from where we'd like to be for the next iteration of this report and make sure that we've put in place the agreements to procure that data in advance, and if it's not readily available, see where else we can obtain it from and how we can triangulate different data sources, etc. Once we've got all of that, there'll be a question as to who provides the analysis of it, who provides the insights to make some intelligence of it, just rather than just being reams and reams of raw data. And again, I think that comes back to one of the outstanding actions we've had in terms of thinking about whether we do replace the former theft risk assessment service with something similar in terms of a centrally provided analytics service. I think it was the right thing to do, not to just leap in and replace TRAS, because definition of madness to repeat the same thing and hope for different results. But the learnings from that original scheme and where we are since, I think could go into a potentially a new service going forward. So again, now that we've got the basis to put together a proper and robust business case for that, that'll be another aspect of our work. I touched upon incentives briefly. We're taking this in three strands. Essentially, we've just completed the first full cycle of the theft detection incentive scheme under RECCo. It was the first thing actually that moved across into RECCo operationally from SPAR and Accusa. That took effect from April 2021, whereas the rest of the retail consolidation followed in September. So all of that scheme year from April 2021 through to the end of March 2022 was reconciled last year, and the money's returned last autumn. Very high returns of payment in excess of 99%. So I think there was success from RECCo operating that scheme, but there are also some lessons learned in terms of the feedback from suppliers, in terms of non-domestic suppliers being given a domestic target because they had a few households that were part and parcel of a multi-site contract and those kind of things. So we're resolving some of those anomalies. In terms of the administration of the scheme, a change has been raised that will hopefully have effect for 1st of April this year. So the scheme should operate that much better for 23-24. But we're also targeting another change for April 24, which will see what we can do to sharpen the incentives more broadly, whether or not we can, for instance, disaggregate those existing domestic and non-domestic incentive scheme pots so that we have a more targeted segmentation of consumers, again, in line with some of the lessons from the theft estimation methodology. And then the third aspect of that would be to look at the value chain as a whole, see where there are issues arising that end up contributing to theft values. And sometimes this isn't always about a deliberate and overt attempt to steal. Sometimes it's because sites aren't properly registered, and then over time people think, well, I'm not being billed for this. Maybe I should do something about it. There are things that happen upstream rather than necessarily the consumer physically tampering with metering, etc. So we'll again look at all of the things that are perhaps going wrong, how they can be improved, and whether or not we can better incentivize parties to tackle those issues. And again, we recognise that there are existing incentives through price controls, etc., on distribution network operators and on gas transporters. So it was very helpful to have had Ofgem at that workshop and recognise and hear firsthand the problems that there are. So again, there's a recognition that we work with those price controls rather than just be put in a box as to something we can't do because it's in existence. We can augment those existing incentives upon network operators if need be. And then finally, as I touched upon, once we recognise that there are dependencies out with the industry, whether it be the police or working with any other agencies, we'll be taking that forward as well to see whether or not we can do things speaking with a collective voice, if you like, on behalf of the industry, and get those arrangements made more robust than the perhaps have been in the past. It was very helpful to have several police representatives at the workshop in November, and I think there are lessons we can learn from the insurance industry and from banking and how they've worked more effectively with police and law enforcement to clamp down on fraud in insurance and in banking, etc. So again, we'll be taking forward work on that in the coming year. So broadly, I think that's all I was going to say on theft. I'll briefly touch upon these other areas of policy development, and I guess these are ones where we are working more with external decision makers, if you like. So it's more about how we feed into these areas. So very briefly cover these, but we put in the 22-23 forward work plan that we wanted to try and improve or contribute to improvements around the operation of the priority services register, the sharing of data relating to vulnerable customers, etc. Recognise the importance of that. we've done a lot of work on that in the past year in terms of engaging with stakeholders in terms of the problems they currently have obtaining data or sharing data. We're also aware that there's been an awful lot of projects initiated in the past to try and unstick some of this and try and facilitate better sharing, potentially just in local regions though, rather than for the market as a whole, or the nation as a whole. And it's still not working as effectively as we like, and we think we can make a contribution to better facilitating that tell me once principle. Again, there's overlap with the some of the open data and consumer consent work that Pete touched upon earlier, but we believe we've identified that given that we operate a legally binding code and we've got an inquiry service that covers every premise in the country, we're probably in a unique position to try and facilitate improvements to this priority service register requirements and improve the kind of user journey on that. So we'll be putting out some proposals by the end of this financial year, i.e. by the end of March, on our thinking on that, and then depending on consultation responses, feedback we get, we'll put together a collaborative project as to how that can be taken forward through 23-24. On third-party intermediaries, again, this is something we've discussed in previous forward work plans. We initially submitted a response to the Ofgem consultation on introducing a code of conduct for suppliers who supply micro businesses. We didn't feel at the time that it was necessarily the best idea to require individual suppliers to put in place those codes of conduct and enforce them individually. And we submitted a similar response when BEIS proposed to regulate the TPI sector. I think the feedback that we've had since the new license conditions went live in the autumn seems to support our view that suppliers are finding it difficult to provide the oversight themselves of that area of the market. We know that some of them are scaling back the relationships they have with a number of brokers simply just because they can't manage to provide that level of oversight over as many brokers as they previously had dealings with. And that could be detrimental, not just for consumers, but potentially for competition itself. And we may find that actually brokers have taken their business elsewhere simply because they don't have that ongoing relationship, or people aren't prepared to provide whatever audits and scrutiny they need of them. So there may be something we can do again by providing more of a central resource, make sure there's a level playing field. We already have a performance assurance framework in place, etc. So again, we'll be holding some workshops very shortly to see whether or not there is a gap there that RECCo can potentially fill. And if there is, we'll share the findings of that set of workshops and seek final feedback before we take anything forward. Similarly, the conclusion might be it's all working fine to the extent that there's no gap for RECCo or the RECCo to fill, in which case that will be the outcome of that those workshops. And again, we'll publish that in full as our findings. I think code reform there's currently a consultation, a call for input issued by Ofgem that closes on the 3rd of February. That's again a kind of a long-standing piece of work. It's been kicking around since 2019. The original proposals around that were developed pretty much at the same time as the original proposals for the Retail Energy Code itself. So I'm hopefully not being naive in saying that what Ofgem seems to have in mind in terms of the development of proactive and empowered code managers is essentially following the model that RECCo has already adopted. So there shouldn't be too many implications for these current proposals upon REC or the Retail Energy Code itself and REC parties. To the extent that there's questions around further consolidation, Ofgem seems to have in mind vertical integration within electricity and within gas, rather than trying to create more horizontal integration between the two. So again, I don't think it would be too affected down at the retail level. There is a proposal that code managers should be licensees, and that's currently going through Parliament, and assuming that legislation passes, we'll obviously need to carry out some work to fulfil what requirements are placed upon us as the REC code manager licensee, to the extent that we'd be the licensee. And we may also need to make some relatively small changes, I think, to change management to make sure that we're fully incorporating the principles around stakeholder advisory forums being established to advise code managers as opposed to industry-led panels. Again, I think that's a fairly small change for us. We already have lots of independent members on all of our panels, in particular the change panel. And I think with heat, this is one that has potentially the broadest impact in terms of the number of the 5 Cs it hits, because it's been driven largely to try and decarbonise heating, obviously. But I think there's also an overlap there with the rationale that Ofgem has put out for codes reform, in the sense that if it goes down the path of setting up an entirely parallel set of license arrangements and a new industry code, etc., I think it'd be creating some of the problems that it's, on the other hand, seeking to address through the codes reform. So I think there'd be a missed opportunity there, and some of that rationale should be applied across the 2 different projects. I'm of the view that the Retail Energy Code covers that kind of space between the regulated industry and the consumer, irrespective of what license might be held. And to an extent, it probably shouldn't make a difference as to whether or not someone heats their home via a gas boiler or they're taking heat directly from something down the road. The consumer protections that RECCo is all about, really, the kind of consumer-facing provisions that we focus on, should apply across the piece. And I think there's an awful lot of synergy there between what we're currently doing for gas and electricity and what is likely to be required for heat. So again, I think there's a piece of work we need to do to kind of set out our stall and make sure that we're at least part of Ofgem's thinking and considered as an option, even if there are other ways potentially delivering new governance and regulation for heat going forward. So that's all I was going to say on those and on theft, but I'm more than happy to take any questions at the end of this section if anybody has any. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Back to me again, but only briefly. I just wanted to talk to you about the evolution of the REC services. So earlier on in the presentation, we went through RECCo's operating model and really focused on that procure and manage function as a key component of our role. In support of that, over the last few months, our commercial team have been working to document and develop a clear set of procurement principles that shape our approach to the evolution of our existing and adoption of any new REC services. I'll take you through the key elements of that. So first of all, we set out to procure services that offer value for money and are scalable. So we're not investing in short-term single-use products, buying lots of new things, but rather services that can continue to evolve and meet the changing needs of industry. Secondly, we only procure to deliver an existing REC obligation or where there's a justified business case to do so. So something that's set out in our approved strategy or forward work plan, or where industry has requested it via the REC change process. So where we have a requirement that meets those criteria, we're then committed to competitive procurement, and that's to ensure that we can benefit from the best that the market has to offer, essentially. And finally, then, experience tells us that the more the work that you do in the pre-procurement process, identifying your requirements, market engagement, gathering stakeholder feedback, learning the lessons from existing or equivalent services, the better outcomes of that procurement exercise and the better end product. So taking all that into account, if we look to the coming year, those principles are going to have a specific impact on 2 of the REC services. So firstly, in relation to the code manager services, it seems to have come around very quickly to me, but the initial term of each of those contracts expires in September of next year. So we're going to spend this year, the RECCo operations team, and in particular Joy, who's the REC code manager services manager, is going to commence our analysis to determine essentially what's worked well, what's working within those code manager service providers, perhaps what hasn't worked so well, and if or where we need to do any repackaging or introduce new requirements to make those services function as efficiently as possible. It's important to say that that won't be done in isolation. I alluded earlier to the importance of stakeholder feedback, so we'll be talking to REC parties about their experiences, other key stakeholders, internal colleagues, and where it's appropriate to do so, the service providers themselves. So we'll start the detailed planning in this coming year, looking to progress to procurement in the next year. And then the second area that we'll be looking at is the energy inquiry services, the EES and the GES, and the other elements that are linked, such as the ESTES. So very plainly speaking, we've got 3 separate data sets relating to the same consumers across 3 different data services with 2 service providers. So again, in this year, we're going to have to look at how we might be able to rationalise that with a minimal impact on users. And again, not going to do any of that without engagement and interaction with industry participants. And I think there's 2 things to take into account here. And I saw that Nick has asked a question sort of relating to this, which we'll pick up in the next stage. But importantly, we need to be mindful of other industry programs that this initiative could impact. So there's some things that could help with, Pete's work around open access to data, and there's some where the choreography of any of those changes we'd need to take careful account of that, and the half-hourly settlement program is an obvious one there. So that was just to give you a flavour of the kind of the principles we use when it comes to procurement, and the foundation activities, the analysis we'll be doing in this year, with then a look ahead to the following two-year period after that. I've seen there's been lots of questions coming into the chat. I think I am leading into that Q&A now, so I'll take a pause and hand back to Jonathan, who can bring some of those questions to the team members.
Brilliant, thanks, Elizabeth. So sticking with you actually for the first question, which has come in around, are there plans to expand the Stay Energy Safe messaging and advertising?
Okay, thank you. So the short answer, I guess, is yes. So yeah, I think we recognise the value of that Stay Energy Safe campaign. We're obviously putting together our forward work plan and putting together the budget for next year. So we're putting in a specific allowance within the budget to build on that Stay Energy Safe campaign, to learn from what's worked well. So I think in the last year we started doing some radio advertising campaigns, online advertising. Let's talk about television. So we need to really understand what's working, where are the messages getting out, where do we need to push more. I think that the other thing is what came out through the theft ASE event that we held earlier in the year that John spoke about, was there's 2 types of awareness that we need to think about. There's actually the industry awareness. So lots of the discussions at that session were people were aware of their own individual part of the process when it came to theft, if you like, and managing, detecting and investigating, but not necessarily how that fitted across from different organisations. So it felt like there was an opportunity for education and awareness within industry, and then also that kind of public awareness programs. So definitely looking to build on what's already there and see the best way to take it forward. And just John spoke about the re-establishment of a theft expert group. It feels like that will also give us then the right group of people to test our engagement strategy with, if you like, and to go and talk to people that are on dealing with it day to day. What's the right messaging? How do we want to get it out there? So I think I saw that question came from Steph. Again, happy to have another conversation about it, but short answer, yes.
Thank you, Elizabeth. The next question is for Pete, which is, what do you envisage your data sources being to shore up the theft, insight and identification?
Yeah, I think it's from Jason at DCC. So a little bit of history. So the TEM report, for those of you who haven't read it, I do recommend a read. It is a long report, but certainly read the management summary because it provides more than just the headline figures spoken about. That was principally based on the TRAS confirmed thefts and potentially confirmed thefts, plus some confirmed thefts from the existing running theft incentive detection scheme under the RECCo. That data was all augmented with decile data, urbanisation data, and other aspects. Forgive me, I've forgotten, but the details within that report, what that allowed us to do was identify this near 1.4 billion number. But it also, in the report, we talked about data sources that we thought would help, but we couldn't get quick or easy access to, or actually didn't exist. So there's 2 primary areas that I see we want to push into. One is in the more distribution space data. So on the low voltage networks, I also recognise that actually the transformers on the low voltage networks are not necessarily metered up to the level of granularity we would like. But for areas that they are metered up, for example, we're aware of, I think it's Cheshire, has very detailed granular metering at a low voltage level. If we can combine that with, Jason, with the consumption data from smart meters in that area, we could do a very kind of empirical, qualitative based approach to identify theft. That in turn, then based on consumption and other aspects, we could potentially roll out as a machine learning model to identify wider. So consumption data is one thing, but we'd also know from consumption data in the TRAS that actually consumption isn't necessarily that helpful in all cases. When combining it with the low voltage data, we believe that's helpful, or the low voltage network data is helpful. The second major data set, I would say, is around tamper alarms on smart meters. So on Monday, I was with some of your colleagues in the Manchester office, Jason, where we were talking about theft data and particularly tamper related data. So if we can combine that tamper related data, potentially some of the use data or energization status data, with known thefts that we've got reports of under the RECCo, we could reverse engineer effectively a model to identify theft. So that's something that I hope to progress over the next coming months. That will allow us to, one, enhance the model to get a more accurate number on theft, but two, then actually mid-term to long-term use that in a more data-driven identification of potential theft within the home or industry. So I hope that answers your question, Jason.
Thanks, Pete. Just want to stick with theft while we're on the topic, and a question's come in, really probably for John, about how do we register our interest to join the theft expert group. So, John, if I could just have a quick answer on that one, please.
Yeah, well, to be honest, we haven't issued invitations out for it yet, but if anyone has an interest now, you could either just add something to the chat or respond to the via the contact details that are at the end of the forward work plan on the very back page. There's an email address on there, and we'll make sure you're kept appraised of when the expert group and subsequently when the forum is first held, and make sure you get that invitation.
Thank you, John. Moving on to the next question, which I'm going to ask Brian to answer, please, which is, to what extent do the changes to the EES as a result of HHS impact RECCo's strategy to implement a combined inquiry service?
Good morning, everyone. I think Elizabeth covered off some of this on her slide on the evolution of the RECC services. On the left-hand side of that slide were some of the key principles that we use and some of the key approaches we use within our procurement strategy. And the two I would draw out from there pertinent to this question is our commitment to procure as often as possible and early as possible, but that comes with some caveats. The biggest caveat is that it's economic to do so. Second caveat is that it's technically feasible, that there is changes in the market that would warrant it. And there's a third caveat that's very important that wasn't on that particular slide, and that is that we always have to balance a desire for procurement and change to reflect any investment that has been made in a service over a number of years leading up to that point, and ensuring that industry receive a return on that investment. So a very good example would have been with the gas inquiry service and the electricity inquiry service at the point of CSS go live. There was significant investment made in those two services to bring them up to CSS requirements, and therefore it was right and proper that those contracts were extended with the service providers for a number of years to ensure that that investment was realised. So then it comes to the question, and this will be some of the things that will be looked at in that project that Elizabeth alluded to. What we're going to do with the RECC services is, what does consolidation mean? And there's permutations and combinations of that. Is it a single database with 3 sets of data within it with one means of access? Is it different service providers with a different front end? Referencing back to what Pete was saying about an API gateway and the concept of microservices is. So there's lots of variations and combinations and permutations that we will need to look at and understand over the coming months. the good thing is we have time to do this. Those contracts they don't expire if my maths are right till 2024, 2025. So we will be initiating that initial work in 23, 24. But the absolute commitment is, as Elizabeth said, at the current basis is we have 3 data sets. There's lots of overlaps within those data sets. It's across 3 multiple service providers and multiple databases. And logic dictates that there is rationalization required to those. Hope that answered your question.
Thank you,
If
Brian.
not,
and I'm going to just have one final question of this Q&A pause before we move on to hear from Brian on the indicative budget. And this one is another one for Pete, which is, with all the transformation topics mentioned today, there are clear overlaps in processes, data and systems. How will these overlaps be managed and prioritised to avoid any conflicting timelines, requirements and any duplication of effort and cost? So Pete, I know you've got a good answer for this one, so I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, John. I think Sarah will be the dictator on whether it's a good answer or not. But if I reference back to the presentation I gave on the kind of 2 themes and 3 sub-themes for each of them, I'm a big believer in pursuit of agile delivery or iterative delivery. And the reason for that is principally because it allows you to adapt much more quickly to change on a short-term horizon. And for those of you who are not familiar with agile delivery, think of it more as a kind of focusing heavily on the work breakdown structure and then being quite selective and focused on delivering smaller packages of work. So if I can take an example, things like the outputs of the open data consumer consent project that's currently running, that will identify a number of changes we need to make to data sets to securely open them up. All of those are going to be kind of point specific things. Some of them might be changes to the code, so we would raise a CP for that and that would go through the standard change process. Some of those changes would be the need for potentially a new API. So Sarah, if we take, for example, meter information or type of meter, that's information that probably should be open to the public, what the domain of or what the mixture of meter types there is across industry. It's not really personal data, but you can only get to it at the moment if you've got access to the inquiry services. So there may be change requests coming in saying, could you please extend by providing these APIs to this data under these circumstances? So through agile delivery, selection of work, and that then allows us to consider the dependency impacts on other programs. Like MHHS is a clear long-term waterfall driven program that is has clear regulatory deadlines that we must hit. So the agile delivery allows us, for example, to move around that. So I hope that starts to answer your question, Sarah. There are lots of other smaller examples I could give to how that works, but I hope it gives you an idea of the way we're thinking in tandem with the principles that Brian set out on procurement activities.
Thanks, Pete. I appreciate that there's quite a lot of detail that sits behind some of the answers that have just been given. So if there are further bits of detail and clarification that anyone who's posed a question or thought they might want to pose a question wishes to ask of us and the team, please do just get in contact and email in, and we'd be happy to have further discussions on any of those topics. So moving on now to the last stage of the formal presentations today, I'm just going to hand it over to Brian to talk us through the indicative budget. So over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Brian O'Shea. I'm the Director of Finance and Commercial at RECCo. I think that probably explains my role, responsibility for the financial management and the commercial management of the company. Alongside that, delivery of our corporate governance obligations and risk management in the company. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. You'll have heard my colleagues over the last hour has outlined what our strategy and objectives are for the coming year. They've talked about our delivery commitment to support and enable parties to discharge their regulatory obligations through the provision of the RECC services, and also detail on the key transformation projects we'll deliver in 2023-24, and in particular, the increased scope required of RECCo under the MHHS project industry initiative. To achieve these, we must have the right level of resources, capacity and capability, both within the organisation and within our service providers. We do this through a blended in-source and outsource model. Sid at the outset alluded to the sort of the headcount within RECCo, and Elizabeth talked about the outsourcing of the services to those who are best placed to deliver the services and manage the risk. First key point I'd like to pick up here is around the budget consultation process. Within the forward work plan, our strategy document, we're required under the REC to set out a long-term view, 3-year projections of what the costs are going to be over that period in delivery of the strategy. We follow that up with a detailed budget consultation. It'll be a comprehensive consultation, and that will go out to parties on and around the 21st of February. And the REC sets out the timescale for parties to provide comment back on the budget. That consultation allows REC parties the opportunity to scrutinise the budget, to provide comment on the budget back to the REC board, and, if required, to appeal to the budget to Ofgem. The REC sets out the criteria on the basis on which appeals can be made. So there is full and open consultation on our budget for the coming year, and the parties have the right to appeal it to Ofgem. As I said, we've included in the forward work plan some 3-year financial projections. What these do is they enable parties to plan for the longer term and provides financial context to the strategic plan. RECCo, like most companies currently, and especially within the energy industry, is continuing to operate in a challenging and evolving environment. RECCo's remit continues to expand. My colleagues will have spoken there about some of the initiatives that we had to deliver last year and some of the things that we're looking to deliver this year. In particular, Pete mentioned a couple of binary projects that, if they go ahead, we will need to incur the costs associated with them. In developing our budget, we use a bottom-up approach. This means that cost estimates must be specific, they must be reasonable, and they are subject to scrutiny on a line-by-line basis at multiple levels within the organisation, and as required by the REC, and as allows party to appeal to Ofgem, external scrutiny as well by the REC parties. Within the forward work plan, you will see that we have provided a comparator to what we were expecting for next year. Our costs for next year are now higher than we expected for that coming year, and we'll now discuss the drivers for this. So if we can have the next slide, Jonathan, please. So I'll just pause there for a moment and give people the opportunity just to look at and see what's on the screen. Our in-source and outsource operating model has lots of benefits. It allows activities to be best placed with those enabled to deliver them. It allows us to do periodic procurement, allows us to take opportunity of the market. What that does is it provides varying types of value to the company. It provides us with cost value, quality value, and innovation value. We get to test those on a regular basis. But our model also carries risk. It could be commercial risk, operational risk, or transformational risk, and we need to ensure those risks are managed to ensure the services are delivered to meet industry's requirements. And it's very important that we need to have the capacity and capability to do that. However, and there's always a however, there's always a but, we recognise that we are spending industry money and consumer money. RECCo doesn't have a balance sheet. We don't have shareholder investments. We don't have the luxury of spending shareholder money. We're spending industry money and consumer money, and we need to be held accountable because of that. We seek to do so effectively to ensure best value is achieved, and we have a number of mechanisms in the organisation to do that. So why have our costs increased? And more importantly, you would ask, what are we doing about it? 80% of the cost increase, the movement from the 42 million expectation to the 56 million expectation, is attributable to 3 key elements. CSS costs have increased by 8 million compared to what we were expecting, which our expectation was based on the latest published figures by DCC in 2021. We have raised a comprehensive challenge to DCC. The REC allows us to do that. We consider the cost that they have provided in their indicative budget to be neither economic nor efficient. And if we are unable to agree the costs, we can refer those to Ofgem for their determination. We are in the process of discussions with DCC on that, and we have a meeting planned for later this week to discuss the revised cost estimates. The second major area of increase is on our MHHS costs. The increase reflects our increased programme obligations and responsibilities, and John Hawkins talked about that earlier. We will carry out a full commercial scrutinisation of all the project costs that are in place at the moment. None of those are committed to at this moment in time, and we will look at those in detail to ensure best value is being delivered. On the MHHS costs, if parties require us to split these out on our invoices and differentiate them on our invoices to ensure that they are identifiable, then that is something we can do. I would encourage funding parties to check with their finance departments and their finance directors to see if any of these costs within their organisations could be classed as capital expenditure. That would allow those costs to be capitalised under International Accounting Standard 38 as an intangible asset, rather than being taken directly to your profit and loss accounts in the coming year. Gas inquiry service costs. This is the other key element where we are experiencing the costs are higher than our expectation. We have a comparator, and that's the electricity inquiry service. We have challenged the service provider, the gas inquiry service provider, to look to re-engineer a solution with the aim of reducing the costs. And I would say that the service provider and its subcontractor have both responded very positively to that challenge. One of the key issues we will there is a key element alongside the cost reduction is ensuring that there is no end user impact of any black box re-engineering. So they're the three key elements that account for 80% of the differentiator between what we were expecting originally for next year versus what our latest expectation is. The remaining 20% is due to some deferred projects from the current year, that we are carrying those over into next year, and we will have the costs associated with them in next year. And also, as Sid spoke about earlier, the right sizing of our organisation. At this moment, the full suite of REC services, of current REC services rather than future REC services, are now live. We understand the ask of us in managing those and delivering those services, and that means we can accurately define what our resource requirements are for the coming years. And as you will see in the projections, there's a fairly stable RECCo operating cost profile over the coming years, with variation based on inflationary inflationary impacts. Final area I'd just like to highlight is that we expect to underspend against this current year's budget. In line with us being a non-profit making company, we will return that underspend to parties once it has been audited and signed off. We would expect to do that in October time, in the October invoice run. And that rebate can be used to offset some of this increased cost expectation for next year. And finally, I'd just like to reiterate that we will be issuing a detailed budget in February, and we will be having a consultation process, and that will allow parties a full opportunity to comment on those. Very happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Brian. There has been one question that I want to cover from theft, and then we will consider any further questions that have arisen. So, John, if I can just come back to you on what measures are being taken to tackle shipperless theft and theft on the portfolio of suppliers who are not proactively looking to identify theft.
Well, I guess shipperless sites is a separate issue. I guess that touches upon what I was saying earlier on about trying to identify issues that might be contributing to those kind of non-technical losses or unidentified gas, as it would be in case of a shipless site, which are not really down to the consumer doing anything wrong in terms of tampering with the meter, etc. I think there's a lot we can do in terms of trying to validate the different data sets that we have, and we'll be looking at whether or not there's things we can do in that. But shippers and GTs in the past, I know I've had specific projects to try and reduce the numbers of unregistered sites on their portfolios. I know it'll be exactly the same in electricity. So again, I think that's part and parcel of what we'll be looking to do once we've identified where those kind of gaps occur, or whether or not we've got potential data sets that can help plug them. So yeah, I would see that as being part of the work, but we haven't got a specific project lined up to do that specifically.
Thank you, John.
Hope that answered the question.
Brian, a question for you, please. When will the REC services annual budget be agreed and published? Parties are provisioning monies and finance teams need to understand the quarterly breakdowns.
I think there's two parts to this question: the publication value, and then how we work it out on a quarterly basis. We've included an indicative budget within the forward work plan. And now I'm going to give a message as much to my colleagues as in answer to this question. I would not be expecting the budget to change materially between now and when we publish the budget on the 21st of February, except where there are some unknowns at this moment in time that become known in the next month or so, as akin to what happened with the market stabilization charge last year. So the budget as published in the current forward work plan, that's a very good indication of what we will be publishing in February. We will be going through a further round of internal challenge over the coming 4 weeks to look for any variations in that budget. But I think if people are pressed for time now and looking to plug money into their internal budgets, REC parties, then I would probably use the numbers that are within the forward work plan. As regards the quarterly values, what we do is that a number of years ago, I think 2 years ago, there was a very strong message came back from industry that they did not want the quarterly values to flex to reflect any seasonality within the budget. What they wanted to know was a per supply point charge at the outset of the year, and that would be applied on an evenly quarterly basis. Therefore, our expectation is that we will do the same for this coming year, that we will divide the budget by 4 and we will invoice that value to 2 parties over the coming year. The significant value of the budget, 99% of the budget, I would say, is recovered from suppliers. There is a small element, which is about I think it's from off the top of my head, I think it's a third of the electricity inquiry service costs, which are recovered from distribution businesses, and that's a carryover from the old MRA days. But from a supplier perspective, if you're looking for your budget, take the 56 million divided by the 56 million supply points in the UK, so it's going to be about £1 per supply point per annum for next year. And we'd invoice 25p in each quarter.
Thanks, Brian. And one more for you, please, which is, who do we speak to about MHHS costs being split out on invoices? Practical one there.
Me or my colleague Blossom, who works in our finance department, who's our company accountant. But if you direct it to me in the first place, if you send the query to Brian at retailenergycode.co.uk or copy in finance at retailenergycode.co.uk. We'll confirm that in.
Great, thank you very much. That concludes the formal questions that we've received, although of course please do email into us if there's anything further that you haven't had an opportunity to ask this morning. The forward work plan document itself is available on our website. Jenny has also posted a link in the meeting chat to the forward work plan itself. as well as a link for some feedback on today's webinar, which we'd really appreciate. The consultation itself closes at the end of this week, which would have been a 2-week period from when it was published just before last weekend. And as Brian has mentioned, the budget consultation will be published next month, and there will also be a webinar to go through the finer details of the budget on the 1st of March. So we'd obviously encourage your participation and engagement with that as well. So that brings me to the conclusion of this morning's webinar. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending. I think, as was mentioned earlier, you will, of course, receive further communications from us with copies of the presentation and a recording from this morning that you're able to look back on and share with your colleagues as appropriate. So thank you for taking the time to join us today. We do appreciate it, and we look forward to further engagement with you all in the future. So thank you very much. Take care and have a good rest of the day.